Season 2 picks up 5 years after the events of Season 1. Unlike how you may have expected to keep up with the cast from last season though, Season 2 brings us a completely new one. It's a brand new setting with a brand new set of characters, and the only common element between them are the tests carried out. Baam does return as the series' focal point, but he's not the main character like how he was last season. No, Season 2 tells the story of lots of different characters. It's a season that portrays more of the middle-class regulars, all while having their plots intertwine with Baam's. It's for this reason that getting to know them is extremely important, since their impact later on might not be as minimal as you might think. So, while the anime may not be able to show every scene with each of this massive cast of characters, this video and the ones to come certainly will. It's an in-depth look into what the anime left out from the manhwa, a comprehensive guide for those who haven't read the story themselves. I'm not sure yet how often I'll make these, but if you want to see more Tower of God content, then be sure to leave a like and let me know in the comments. But anyway, I suppose you might need a recap on the way Season 1 ended, so the gist is that Rachel bad. She watched Baam do everything she couldn't, and that led to resentment since it was as if he took everything she wanted away from her. This led to her deal with Head-On, along with the subsequent move to push Baam out the bubble. A lengthy series of events orchestrated mostly by her. As a guide whose powers bordered on near foresight, her task was to make Rachel the main character, a task she completed the moment Rachel pushed Baam out the bubble. This allowed her to move on to her next job, which was to take Baam and guide him up the tower a different way. Of course, there was so much more going on behind the scenes, but the purpose of all this was to ensure the Jahard family thought Baam was dead. That was the main reason why all this happened, and the next steps are what's coming together now in Season 2. So, fast forward 5 years after the events of Season 1, and that brings us to the opening scene with Yuri, a place formerly known as Jahard's 5th floating castle and the resident palace of Repelista Jahard. The butler is Repelista's guide, and his name is Alamek Edrock. The princess after is Kun Masheni Jahard, and she's the owner of the Yellow May. If her hair wasn't enough to give it away, then knowing her name should make it clear that she's related to this Kun. Not fully since their mothers are different, but they are half-siblings since their father is the same. Her age isn't something we're given, but if she's old enough to mock Yuri for being too young, then it's likely her age is well into the thousands. In any case, we saw Yuri wanting to know the truth about Baam, but the reason isn't just because he earned her respect. She was actually a lot more desperate than how the anime portrayed her, and the reason for that is because of, well, this. She seems to be quite obsessed in more ways than one. This was enough to get Repelista to help her, but the return of the prince meant she couldn't leave her room either. Whatever way she's involved in the events to come, it's implied that it's something she needs to be actively present for, both her and her impressive array of lighthouses. Now, Floor 20 is where the main story really begins, and the majority of the floor is a massive floating castle itself. It's this giant hub bearing the symbol of the great family that owns it, shaped like the hull of a ship as if to continue with the ocean theme. Passing here meant you became an officially ranked E-class regular, and along with it came quite the array of benefits. To actually pass was a whole different story on its own though, so that's what the first 4 episodes pretty much focus on. To start things off with episode 1, the beginning introduces this new setting fairly accurately. Our new protagonist is clearly established, and we're quickly brought up to speed with the type of situation he's in. Where we really learn quite a bit more about him is through the conversation he had here with Nia. You see, it was when asking about why Nia wasn't taking the tests that Wangnan would make his own assumptions first. This was actually him just projecting his own circumstances, and it's through that we learn why he continues to take the tests himself. As it turns out, despite the hard tests, the steep price, and the overpowered competitors from the 10 great families, climbing the tower wasn't a dream that he could give up on. It didn't matter how little of a chance he thought he had, because to him he felt he needed to try as much as possible. Sure, he could call life unfair and blame everything around him, but if he wanted to find out who he really was, pursuing his dreams was the only way to do that. There was this true sense of conviction to find the real him. One that undoubtedly relates to his position as prince. It's when we move on now to the 30-minute survival test that more of the main cast is introduced to us. There's Baam moonlighting as Viole, Kang the massive teddy bear, Misang, Gosang, then Arc Raptor. Much of their introductions need no elaboration, but if you're wondering the relationship between Misang and Gosang, the author confirmed there's something akin to cousins, not siblings. Now, Wang Nan's outburst was a lot more abrasive in the manhwa since he really digs deep into the whole abandonment idea. He essentially called Misang complacent and useless, which could very well just be him projecting his own issues again. Either way, we now know how it is a child like her got here. It's an occurrence that's more common than you might think. Arc Raptor's problem next wasn't so much directed at Misang and Gosang specifically, but was rather just an issue with having too many survivors. You see, if the next test had all of them competing against each other, then it makes sense to want less people to fight against. That's why he decided to do a vote, since the alternative to him would, in his own words, involve bloodshed. It was far better to vote than to work things out by fighting. This does tie into Arc Raptor's character development later, but for now all you need to know is how it works to define who he is right now. That was the point of showing each character one by one, as the manhwa equivalent intended solely to introduce everyone. The author wanted to show the difference between this cast and Season 1's cast, since if Season 1 represented the upper class members of the tower, Season 2 is then more to showcase the middle class. That's not to say this middle class doesn't have incredible potential on their own, but when compared to Endorsee's strength or Kun's brains, it's important to know they can't really be compared. There's a huge difference between the power of the 10 great families and everyone else. Baam's reveal introduces his affiliation to FUG, which, as Misang said, is the most influential crime syndicate in the tower. They're the organization that set itself against the 10 great families, a group known to be so incredibly powerful that the odds of one being here now just didn't make sense to anyone. That doubt didn't last for very long though, because when a random test taker walked through the door during all the commotion, Baam immediately laid him out and eliminated him in front of everyone. It was a cutscene that not only highlighted his power, but at the same time served as the motivation to get the others to team up. The fight then continues pretty much as we saw, with the exception of a minor detail adding to the ambiguity behind whatever this was. You see, Wang Nan had already been tossing his bombs at Baam before. He had used the strongest ones in his inventory, yet not a single one seemed to affect him. That left only his cheap gum bombs, which to him were nothing more than a futile last effort. They were so weak that he didn't actually think they were gonna do anything. That's why he was so shocked when they actually did, since to see him tank all those crazy attacks before, it didn't make sense why these would work. It was a situation made even more confusing by the appearance of what the author describes as a lobster. Obviously that's not actually what it is, but apparently it's the author's way of incorporating shonen elements. This whole sequence of action was intended to make it feel as such. That's not to say Tower of God is a shonen through and through though, since the author likes to make it feel like a whole lot of different genres. He wants it to feel like something more mature than that, since the problems presented are associated more with people in their 20s, not their teens. This was actually why he made Season 2 start on the 20th floor, and it's the reason we see our new protagonist deal with problems like crippling debt. This brings us now to episode 2, where in between this bit of relaxation, another regular is shown to arrive with quite a different story. His circumstances were very much the same as Wang Nan's, but the group he was in was a lot more hostile. So much so that he could barely walk after. It was only a matter of time then before he would collapse, and it was in that moment that he would start to beg. A cry for help that would get Gosang to react. Unfortunately, Wang Nan would convince her not to, since to do so now would just mean having to go against him later. It was common sense and the only move to make right now. Fast forward to the introduction of Yun, and her situation was just the byproduct of poor power control. She had failed her test because she had burned everyone, including her teammates, leading her to this position as a helper to Prince. This we already know from what they showed in the anime, but what you may not know is how Test 2 is an idea borrowed from Dragon Ball's Tenchi Bukai test. Just like how the Shinsu wall test was a shonen classic, so too was this a common staple the author wanted to implement in his story. It was a test he chose purely because he thought it would be fun. Also because all the previous tests have always been so complicated. Since a big brain like Kun starts to trivialize a lot of the simpler tests, you need the games to be more complex to highlight his true potential. This was what SIU mentioned is the biggest difference between seasons 1 and 2. Now, the test proceeded exactly as we saw, all the way up to when Baam went. Though not mentioned in the anime, the move he used was a special ability called Flare Wave Explosion, an incredibly strong Shinsu technique which made it clear he most definitely was Fug. I won't get too deep into how it works right now, but the basic idea is that it uses reverse flow control to transfer the shock of Shinsu from one's body to a target. I don't fully understand how it works myself, but from what I've read, it's apparently a very dangerous skill, one that only members of Fug are said to have mastered. This was why Love was so visibly shocked, since Baam's presence was a sign of disrespect to everything the tower stood for. He's a living representation of straight-up rebellion. So, Love changing the criteria to pass seemed to me like his own way of fighting back. By forcing Baam to choose teammates to go along with him, he was effectively having him abide by the rules of the tower, not whatever rules him or Fug had created. This led to the ridiculous outburst from Wangnan and the others, followed by an even more ridiculous argument between him and Yeon. She was describing herself as this powerful fisherman, but her inability to control her flames wasn't something to be overlooked. It was a sore point Wangnan kept hammering home over and over again. Eventually, this led Yeon to explode, and with it came a comment you probably wouldn't expect from her. It was a comical response that Wangnan was more than ready to counter. That's when Baam would say he wasn't going to bring anyone, which to Love wasn't something he was so willing to accept. Reason being that it didn't matter who Baam thought he was because the rules of the exam weren't to be changed for anyone. That was what Love mentioned to be an absolute rule of the tower. It also wasn't fair to any of the other regulars either, since most, if not all, were willing to do anything to pass. It wasn't Baam's right to be able to deny them from that. Now, the end of episode 2 is where we learn a bit more about Yeon, specifically on how she feels about the standards she needs to live up to and her subsequent plan to befriend Baam then kill him after. She couldn't just team up with him without consequence, so in order to reprove herself after a disgrace like that, she figured the only way to do so was to kill him. So, this brings us to that awkward befriending part where it does highlight some of Yeon's accomplishments. In addition to getting some of the highest scores, there was no dismissing the fact that she had climbed to floor 20 all by herself. She didn't use her family or anyone else, but instead did things solo and did so in less than the time that it took Baam to. It was a pretty amazing feat regardless of who you were. This brings us now to a completely cut out bath scene, which for the most part developed a lot of the new characters. Arkraptor and Kang didn't see any problem with being seen as anti-Jihad, so even if they did end up joining with Baam, it wasn't a situation they were particularly worried about. Kang then questioned whether Arkraptor actually had a daughter or not, to which the answer was obvious considering how he treated Misang. Though it looked as if he was trying to get her to fail, to Kang it seemed like he was more so just trying to prevent her from getting hurt. It was subtle behavior which one could only assume comes from someone who did have a daughter. Arkraptor never did answer Kang's question, but he did respond with a question of his own. A simple inquiry confirming he was into Goseng. It was after this that the two would make their way to the open bath, where they would then discuss the next test with Wangnan and Nia. A simple conversation not particularly important, up until Prince's arrival a little bit after. It seemed everyone else was avoiding Baam, but for someone like Prince, he saw it more as a challenge. You see, he wanted to show he wasn't afraid of Fug and even let Baam know he wasn't gonna lose to him. It was a bold move Baam unfortunately couldn't be bothered by, since the only attention he gave was a very brief amount to Rap Devil, the Devil's right arm who supposedly beat Hats. This was the only thing that actually intrigued Baam, and it made him curious enough to say he was looking forward to seeing the Devil. It was a statement that went to ignore Prince completely, the core reason behind this interaction in episode 3. Prince had also stormed out the bath and tried to interrupt Baam here, then even followed him into the hallway and confronted him before the test. It led to a cut conversation between him and Yeon where the extent was her telling him how little she wanted to do with him. Yet another one of the many scenes in which Prince's ego was getting the better of him. Of course, only to be met with some very cold rejection. The main point for all, though, was to basically show how persistent and narcissistic he is. But anyway, episode 3 starts off with yet another new character who's a high ranker going by the name of Augustus. He's the test director responsible for Floor 20 and, just like you, ensures the tests are running properly. Love is simply the administrator conducting the test, and his job is to at most oversee everything. His bias towards Fug isn't supposed to change that, which is why Augustus needed to be so stern with him. Just because Love thinks Baam is evil doesn't mean he deserves unfair treatment apart from everyone else. This was the message Augustus was trying to send, but unfortunately Love was very adamant about saying no. Even more so to all Augustus's follow-up questions. In any case, there was a cutscene after where something popped up which made Love nervous, but the context for that isn't something we'll get till later. I suppose the next scene worth mentioning is the one where they're playing cards, since it's here there was actually a nice heartfelt moment between Arcraptor and Miseng. After having lost numerous times because of Kang's back symbols, Arcraptor decided to play around with Miseng. It was a game she was at first hesitant to try, but got way more into the more she played. By the end, she was having quite a bit of fun, and she had totally forgotten how scary Arcraptor initially was to her. It was a small bonding moment enough to make Arcraptor smile. Now, it was this fun which led to an interesting scene after, since that comment Goseng made seemed to weigh heavily on all of them. Sure, it would be nice to live like they are now and forget about the tower completely, but each knew that that was something they couldn't do. They all had reasons for why they needed to keep on climbing. They wouldn't be here taking these tests if they didn't. Goseng only realized this after, so she quickly apologized, then went back to her own room. It was an impactful scene where not that many words were said, but a strong message was conveyed through the expressions of everyone. The message that climbing the tower trumped everything to them. This brings us now to the final test, which is a lot less confusing when you understand it as a simple race against Baam. Either he beats Love and secures his room for himself, or the other secures 7 teammates in 6 rooms before that. I'll talk more about the specifics in the next video, but for now I hope this video added to your Tower of God watching experience. If it didn't, you want to see more, then be sure to leave a like and let me know down in the comments. Also let me know what you think of Season 2 so far. For me, I'm not finding it all that bad, since all in all there isn't too much the anime's left out. I do miss the original art style of Season 1, but Kevin Penkin's music just makes the atmosphere that much better. That said, I'll try to continue the series so long as there's a demand for it, but it will be in between slime videos. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!